thank you all for being here today for another episode of our Living Legends. A wonderful way to celebrate Black History Month, but really we're coming to figure out a great way just to celebrate those who are connected to our congregation and so many amazing stories that need to be told. And today is not a different day from all of that. We have the absolutely amazing Dr. Stephen Millner with us, who is former chair of the African American Studies at San Jose State.
On four different occasions.
On four?
Yes. A chair's term goes 4 years.
Okay.
And usually after 4 years, you've had burnout from report writing, teaching, et cetera, so you try and transition and let other people get some exposure and some experience. But 4 different occasions, I had to chair the department.
Wow.
And in each of those occasions, the department was threatened with being destroyed.
Really?
Yes. And now San Jose State doesn't face that kind of burden because now there's an ethnic studies requirement for graduation for all students.
Wow.
But in the 70s and 80s and 90s, we always had to fight just to stay alive. And I was able to help with others guide us through some of those murky waters.
Absolutely. And you know, looking back at history now, like it wouldn't seem like that would be the case at San Jose State. I mean, you have Speed City that rises out of that. You have this connection between activism and sports. I mean, it's almost like a hub in many ways for African American thought and, you know, pushing the envelope. But just to even hear that even there, it wasn't always clear sailing or easy sailing.
For people in America, especially people of color, it's never been and it never will be smooth sailing without facing challenges in life.
Wow.
That's what we all have to do.
Yeah.
Okay,
well, let's jump into it. So one of the first questions I have, we talked about it. You chaired the African American Studies program, really in the field of history, 4 times, but your degree actually was in sociology. How did you make that kind of shift from one to the other?
It is a strange kind of evolution. To get into sociology, I was attracted to sociology when I was a high school student in a place called Duarte, California, which is in LA County.
Okay.
Our family got to LA County on the 27th of January, 1960. I'd never forget that day because it was first day in California. It's also my father's birthday. So it's easy to remember. And he was a visionary in his own way. He wanted us to have a chance to get university educations. With 5 children, all of us born between 1945 and 1951, he was not going to be able to educate us in Columbus, Ohio, because tuition was high there, everything was expensive, and he had a postman's salary.
Wow.
And a postman's salary in the 50s and 60s was not what it is today.
Okay.
And my mother, with 5 kids, being born between 45 and 51, she was a stay-at-home mother. So his vision was to find a place, California, where all his children would have a chance at higher education. In the 1960s, you could go through from K through graduate school without paying any tuition in California.
Really?
That was a lure. And with 5 kids, that's what attracted him. It was partially the weather, but it was also the weather of education, and that was his real obsession.
Absolutely.
Both he and my mother had gone to Ohio State, but they couldn't finish because it was the tail end of what was called the Great Depression. Although if you knew my dad, you knew he never put those two words together, because he said there was nothing great about the Depression. And he was accurate.
Correct.
Because, it was a time when people were dependent on charity, and my dad's family never accepted charity. They never wanted that. They were, really intense in terms of their focus on hard work would deliver.
Wow. So that's what shifts you to California, right?
Yes.
The education, and I mean, just to even think about education not coming at a cost, like that's a whole line of conversation that we could go in the way in which education now has become another issue why you don't get education. It's not because of ability, but really it's just because of cost, right?
Well, conservative Republicans put a stop to that in the late 60s when Ronald Reagan was first elected governor of California. He not only, became someone that people of my generation with my politics tended to reject because Reagan said, let the blood flow in the streets when the students were protesting against the war in Vietnam.
Wow.
And that was something that, really, I've never forgotten.
Yeah.
But he also imposed the first tuition on public education in California. And from $50 a year, it has escalated now to thousands.
Tens of thousands.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, you always have to watch and oppose people who try to keep the barriers to higher education up.
Yeah.
And conservative Republicans at that point, and some would say even today, are in the forefront of that. So we were very fortunate.
Yeah. So now that gets you into school, that opens up a world of opportunities, but that still doesn't speak to how do you shift from sociology then to history? Like, was there always something there? What really drew you to kind of make that transition in your professional life?
Well, I was living history because we got to California just before things were really beginning to percolate and kick off. We were living 7 miles away from South Central Los Angeles in August of 1965 when the first Watts Rebellion, because it wasn't a riot, it was a rebellion against the circumstances of life that all of us were facing. The police in LA County were 95% white, and they were aggressive.
Yeah.
And we saw that constantly. So those kinds of things, were impacting me. And I was a newspaper reader from an early age.
Okay.
I read Jet magazine every week, but I also read the Chicago Defender.
Yeah, it's a huge one.
Yes, it was in the 60s, it was a daily paper.
Wow.
And I had a lot of relatives in Chicago, and we got that in Columbus, but I also got the LA Times every single day. I learned to read through getting exposed to that from my mom and dad.
Yeah.
And I was reading about the civil rights movement every day in the early 60s.
Wow.
And I noticed that sociologists tended to support the idea that people of color should be treated with respect and rights should be granted. So when I graduated from high school, the first major I declared was sociology. 18 years old, and I never wavered from that. But by the time I got to Berkeley, still studying the movement, I noticed that there were very few folks who were doing serious work about how the civil rights movement was based on people, not just leaders.
Correct.
And That's the way a sociologist looks at social movements. So looking at that and spending time in the Deep South, I got immersed in reading everything I could about the history of slavery, the history of segregation, and the history of struggle against the movement. So when I graduated from Cal, I had several chances to teach in different locations. I had a chance to go to the Ohio State University.
The Ohio State.
Yes, and that would have been going home.
Okay.
I had a chance to teach at the University of Alabama.
Okay.
And then I had an offer to teach at Ole Miss in Southern Studies and Sociology. And Mississippi was the most challenging spot that I could have selected. And I've always had a disposition to take the hard road, not the easy road. Because you take the hard road, you can sometimes lift as you climb and help others along the way.
Yeah, yeah. So now you make this huge shift and you move now Mississippi, right? And you become one of the first groups of African American teachers, correct? That
Well, I went into Ole Miss in 1982. There were exactly 20 years after James Meredith had become the first student there.
Wow.
And there were still bullet holes in the buildings where the rioters had tried to prevent Meredith from enrolling.
Wow.
It was a challenge. I will never forget the first day I went into a class. I had a class of 113 people on my roster.
Okay.
When I walked in, there were about 7 students who immediately, seeing me, stood up and walked out. 3 of them were white males who spit on the floor and said that I didn't come here to Ole Miss to be taught by one of these, new, and they used the N-word. So at that point, I knew I was in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
For the next 2 years, I stood my ground and made a difference.
Yeah.
Because coming to Ole Miss from Berkeley, the black students, and there were about 200 black students at Ole Miss at the time, they looked at me as someone that they could identify with, and they expected me to make a difference.
Correct.
So I became the BSU advisor in the first semester I was there.
Yeah.
And the issue we took on was disassociating the University of Mississippi from the rebel flag, the Confederate battle flag. And that was a struggle. The students were deeply involved and deeply committed to that. And over the course of a year and a half, we managed to pull enough demonstrations to force the university to disassociate itself from that flag.
Wow. Now that in and of itself in Mississippi is huge. I mean, even recently, as recent as 2020, 2021, there's still places that are wrestling with the usage of the Confederate flag, right? Where it's flown, where it should be taken down. And to know that back in the 1980s, you guys are leading.
Well, it was enough of an issue that the Mississippi Ku Klux Klan came to the campus and marched in protest against the university disassociating itself from that flag. And one of the places that they marched down and around my house on campus, because I was living on a campus-owned house for safety and security. They marched around my house, and this was in, I think, March of 1983. and they marched around, and when they came around the second time, I was standing in my door. And they saw me standing in my door, and I was holding some equipment that indicated that I was a son of my father who had taught all his sons how to go into the woods and the fields and hunt. And as much as I admired Dr. King, I also respected Malcolm X.
I felt that coming.
So I had the equipment to let them know that while I was a nonviolent person against people who were, peaceful, I was also a black man who would protect himself if it came to that.
Wow.
And they quickly marched up the little hill, and I had no trouble at all after that little encounter.
Wow. So, I mean, this is amazing work, amazing things that are happening at, Ole Miss. What makes you transition back to California?
Well, I love my family. I love my wife, and I would not subject my children to the kind of passage that they would have encountered going through that grief.
Yeah.
So during the time I was teaching at Ole Miss full time, my wife and my children were still living here in San Jose.
Ah, okay.
And teaching at Ole Miss was a blessing, but it was also a curse.
Yeah.
Because I could not allow my children to go to the schools and endure the kind of taunts and the other stuff that would have gone with that.
Yeah.
And my wife was from Louisiana,
Okay.
So she knew what the South was.
Absolutely.
So we had an agreement that, we'd keep things together, and I would do what I could, and we would resume our life here in California, because California is the best place. And I've lived in Mississippi, and part of why I went to Ole Miss is my slave ancestors on my mother's side had been slaves in Mississippi. And my slave ancestors on my father's side had been slaves in Virginia.
Okay.
So that played a big part of it.
Yeah.
But getting back to California was always the plan.
Yeah.
But I also did 12 summers teaching summer school at Ole Miss.
Okay.
Because, they liked my work. And I like giving back to the kids in Mississippi.
And of course, I can't help but take this segue. So you mentioned that you have been able to trace your ancestry, right? Both to slavery in Virginia, but also there seems to be some amazing history through your maternal side, right? With your slavery that happened in Mississippi. Correct?
Well, on my mother's side, the slaves served on a plantation 20 miles east of Jackson. And the slave owner had 3 children with his slave named Sabreth. And when he was going toward his passage toward death, he gave her 3 bags of gold with the instructions that she be taken to Vicksburg and put on a flatboat and sent to the north.
Wow. And
And she took those 3 bags of gold and her 3 children by him, and ultimately bought 120 acres of property in Meigs County, Ohio, which is right on the border of the Ohio River. So they were, a stone's throw away from the South.
Yeah.
Because when you went across that Ohio River, you were in West Virginia or Kentucky. And I was always warned, stay away from the South as a kid for all kinds of reasons.
of course.
On my father's side, the slaves from Virginia had been emancipated as well. So there was a little colony in Meigs County and Jackson County, Ohio. And some of those slaves had been emancipated by people like Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and those folks were all mingling together in that part of Ohio in the 1840s, 1850s. And Sabreth used her acreage to let slaves who were trying to escape have a resting place, kind of like a station on the Underground Railroad. Yeah. So all that was part of the legacy I had as a kid growing up in Ohio.
Wow.
We would go down to the family homestead once a summer and visit, and then we'd sometimes have family reunions. Now, I have to tell you, some of my relatives were color struck, if you understand what that means.
Please expound.
A lot of blacks in the 40s and 50s thought that, quote, light-skinned blacks were better than dark-skinned blacks. And that was especially troubling in some families. I had some relatives who would sit in the family reunions and they wouldn't speak to the darker-skinned Negroes, as we were called, because they thought that, that they were, quote, quality people, and others were lesser. And some of them bragged that, that they had the blood of the aristocrats. Yes. And some were bragging about the fact that they were Hemings relatives and stuff like that. None of that made any difference to me. I just liked the best fried chicken. But, a lot of my folks had to go through a consciousness changing in the 60s when people stopped calling themselves Negroes and started embracing the beauty of blackness. And the beauty of blackness is the fact that people struggle without turning their back on their fellows. And that's the ethic that I've always encouraged people to have.
I mean, to me, that brings up so much, right? From, this amazing history, this emancipation that we have, even before, there's the movement of the abolition of slavery. We have groups that are literally living into what will hopefully become true for everybody else, but still laden in families. Is a history of the vestiges of slavery, who makes one better, what makes one better, and even the way that affects, black families. It's always amazing to me, which to me makes it almost even more pernicious when we hear about stories of, let's not talk about, race, or let's not talk about the ways in which this is implanted into structures or into institutions. Like, it was a thing that happened then, and then once it stopped, everything went away. And we can constantly see that not only is that not the case, but it never has been the case, nor will it ever be.
Unfortunately, life is a struggle.
Yeah.
And you have to turn to family, and you have to turn to the good book in many ways to get through this life and to retain your dignity.
Absolutely.
I, was thinking about that first day teaching at Ole Miss, and before I went into the class that morning, I read the 23rd Psalm because I knew, and it was plain as day, that I was in the valley, and the shadow of death was all around.
Literally marching down your street.
Yes.
And so, again, you're doing great, amazing segue, right? So, how does faith kind of inspire your story? How did it help you through to kind of become who you are?
My first consciousness of language, the Lord is my shepherd, and the prayers that children are taught. That's my first consciousness, and it was coming from my mother, from my grandmother, and the first kindergarten that I went through was in the basement of a church because I went to a segregated school system in Ohio.
Okay.
And We had no facilities for kindergarten, but they were going to make a way for folks. And
Train our kids.
the Second Baptist Church on 2nd Avenue in Urban Crest, Ohio, opened its basement to the kindergarten. So we went down there and, we learned our ABCs, and we also, got our Bible stories because this was in the mid-50s and you could still get that in the mid-50s. So I've learned over time who will stand up for us and why. And the dignity of the Lord in anointing us and the struggles that everyone has to go through, personal and collectively, has not been lost on me.
Yeah.
And looking at the civil rights movement and studying where the people based their struggles.
Yeah.
The black church in the South was the bedrock.
Yeah.
And I've been to all the major churches in the South and worshiped and got contacts with people who were the backbone of the Montgomery bus boycott.
Correct. Yeah.
And ultimately, I was able to interview and publish wonderful stories about them and ultimately meet Mrs. Rosa Parks in Detroit on January the 20th, 1980. Wow. And one of the things that we talked about was how her faith allowed her to sustain her life in all the turmoil that she encountered.
Yeah.
And I certainly understand that.
Yeah. Wow. This is so. So we've talked about some of the history. We talked about family. We talked a little bit about family. Some of your older history, but I also hear that you have a variety of hobbies since retirement, right? Any of those hobbies you would love to speak to?
Well, the most important hobby I have now is that I'm a caregiver for my 8-month-old granddaughter, my second granddaughter.
Okay.
And my wife Joyce and I, we take care of our granddaughter, Isabella, 8 months old, 5 days a week from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening. So life has come full circle.
Right.
When I was at San Jose State for more than 25 years, the last 25 years of my 43 years there, I would teach the Black Family course because family is the most essential structure in any society. And I also taught the Black Child course. And when you teach the Black Child course, you have to take it from infancy through adolescence. And now I've studied all that, but I've come back and I'm now a caregiver. So my hobbies, reading, following the struggle, teaching cinema courses and watching movies takes a back seat to my caregiving to my 8-month-old.
Yeah.
So I'm now watching for first teeth, making sure that that everything is taken care of with the diaper changes, and that's the most masculine kind of stuff that I can do. I could ever do. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's as important as standing in my door protecting my house.
Right. Correct. And in many ways, that's exactly. It's one and the same in many ways. This
It's
is you
exactly one and the same.
Standing in your door, protecting your house, and the legacy that will go. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful way to phrase that. Wonderful way to phrase it. So, thinking about your story, and I imagine there are a variety of other things that we could talk about. I know that there's ways that even while you were teaching at San Jose State, that you entered into teaching at the penal institutions as well. Any piece that you would like to speak to?
Oh. I always introduce my classes at San Jose State with a kind of joke. I would announce that that I had done 5 years at Soledad Prison. And I really had. And I did 5 years at Soledad from 1987 through 1992.
Okay.
Locked behind 7 steel doors. But I would say that, and I say, and if you don't want somebody who's been in prison as your teacher, you better get up and leave now, because, I disclose this stuff. And then I, would pause for 15 seconds and mention, and I did all that time as a teacher.
Wow.
Because in the late 80s, blacks were 6% of the population in California, but 40% of the prisoners. And if you are really going to serve our people, you have to serve them where they are. And there were people in the prison system who were just doing everything they could to transform themselves. And if I had a chance to go in, and I had that chance, I was going to do it. But it was nerve-wracking.
I can only imagine.
Because when you go into a prison as staff, you're warned. If something kicks off, we are not going to negotiate your release, because they can't. They really can't. But they would give me a squawk box, and they would tell me, okay, if something happens in the classroom, hit it, and we'll be there within 28 to 32 seconds. And I laughed.
Right.
I said, do you know what they can do to me in 28 seconds? And, so they started stationing a guard right outside the classroom. And you know who the guard was? She was 5'2", and she must have weighed 115 pounds. And she would sit there while I was in the classroom.
Okay.
And it tickled me, because she would always be reading as she sat outside the classroom door. And I'd look down at her reading material, and I'd say, okay, turn it to the 23rd Psalm. And that's what I would read before I would go into the classroom.
Wow.
As well.
Yeah.
Because the classroom was fascinating. We had 1/3 Mexican.
Okay.
And they were split between the Northerners and the Southerners.
Okay.
So they would often be at each other.
Right.
We had 1/3 whites.
Okay.
And then we had 1/3 blacks.
Wow. It's a pretty good mix.
Yeah, it was a mix. But the first day I went in, they were sitting in their groups. And I said, oh, I got to change this. So I said, if you want to stay in this class with me, you're going to have to sit alphabetically. And if you don't want to do that, you're not going to stay in this class, and you're not going to get this credit. Because being in the class gave them a day off for good time.
Wow.
So there was a real incentive.
Yeah.
So I broke all that sitting in,
In your
clusters.
group. Yeah.
And a lot of them liked it, because I said, when you're in this class, you are not in the prison, you're in my classroom, and you're getting academic credit.
Yeah.
So it was a haven for them.
Wow.
But it wasn't a haven for me. Because when a lockdown would happen, I'd still have my homework assignments. So I would go into the prison when they were locked down, and I would go to every wing and deliver my homework assignments to my students.
Wow.
And I've been to X Wing in Soledad, which is where the Soledad brothers and the guards had their encounters way back in the 70s. So I've seen protective custody, I've seen X Wing, I've seen every part of Soledad.
Wow.
And it's, it's intense. It changes you.
Yeah.
It, not when you're visiting, but when you're working there, you're in prison too. But that's where our people were, and that's who I wanted to reach.
Absolutely. And sadly enough, it's probably where our people still are.
A lot of them.
Yeah, quite a bit. we've often talked about, disparities between African American children and, others, white children, Asian American children. In your experience, have you seen progress towards that end, or has that disparity only gotten worse?
Well, when attention is taken away from the causes of poverty, and that tends to be hopelessness. When kids go to school and they don't have teachers that believe that they can do it, who don't take the time to educate them, who don't assign books and then follow through to make sure that they read. When I was going to those wings in the prison to give my homework to those prisoners, I was doing it because I was telling them that their work counted. If you have teachers now who don't really care about what their students produce, then the students aren't going to care themselves. I knew from the time I was 6 years old that I had to be twice as good to get half as much. That's the saying that my teachers raised us on. So I worked twice as hard to get my grades, and it was still a challenge. So the quality of teachers is what's really important in terms of guiding folks toward achievement. And the quality of ministers is also just as important.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally agree. I feel like that directly impacts the community as best as possible, and whether people utilize it or not, just your presence there, the voice that you can provide, the opportunities that we get a chance to provide as the history of the Black church is always important.
Yes.
From our after school program to our food program, things that are just inherent to the way that we think about ministry. It's like we can do no other,
As I said, I started kindergarten in the church basement. So the church and education, as far as I'm concerned, have always gone together and must go together.
Absolutely, absolutely. So closing out then, as we've talked about a variety of aspects of your story and still plenty more that we didn't get a chance to touch. For those that are watching, for those that are listening, what would you like them to remember most about your story and your life?
Well, my parents made a way, and they made a way so that the road would be easier for me. But they also left a legacy, and they told me and my siblings to do what we could to make a way for others and to stay on the path of the righteous. The 5 kids that came from Columbus, Ohio's segregated circumstances, my oldest brother became a professor at Cal Poly. He has a PhD in physical chemistry.
Wow.
So nobody can tell me that Black folks can't do science and stuff.
Absolutely.
My other brother has a PhD from the University of Oregon. I have a PhD from Berkeley. My sister had a law degree from Stanford. And then there's always got to be one who just
bucks the system.
Yes. My baby brother retired and didn't work after he was 49 years old because he has a law degree from Harvard and worked in Portland and did well. So all of us, got educated, and it was all because of the sacrifices that those before us made for us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is amazing, to come from segregation to 5 children with advanced degrees, despite all the odds, right? I think for me, that's part of the beauty and the ingenuity of the black community, Black families, that oftentimes does get overlooked. Like, we can still talk about where all the places that we need to grow, especially as a community. But man, all of these stories that show just how powerful we can be when we really get the opportunity. Still always amazes me, impresses me. Thank you.
You're more than welcome.
Thank you. I felt like you were going to say something else. Feel free. If there's something else you wanted to add, please, we'll take it.
That's plenty.
Well, thank you all so much for your time today. I pray that you were encouraged, inspired as we continue to talk to living legends. God bless you.